So our last talk today is a little bit different, and where this one really comes from, this is Carlos Maltzahn from UC Santa Cruz, and this is about the open source program office that they created at Santa Cruz this past year. And this is really an outgrowth of the development of Ceph at Santa Cruz several years ago, and how they are then going to use this open source office in order to help drive the creation of businesses for students and faculty based off of the research work that they're doing. So this is really, that's what this talk is going to be about. So with that, if you could play the video.
I'm Carlos Maltzahn from the University of California, Santa Cruz. I like to thank Dr. Jay Lofstedt, Dr. Kevin Colville, and Dr. Werner Janse van Rensburg for inviting me to talk to you about the open source program office in UC Santa Cruz. I really like the motto of this conference, democratization of cyber infrastructure for sustainable development. First, a few words about myself. I'm an adjunct professor for computer science engineering at UC Santa Cruz. I'm also the founder and director of this open source program office at UC Santa Cruz, the founder and director of the Center for Research in Open Source Software, as well as the co-founder and director of the UCSC Systems Research Laboratory. Before I joined UC Santa Cruz, I was a performance engineer at NetApp. I'm currently advising 5 PhD students, and I've graduated 9 PhD students and 12 master students since I joined. A quick overview of the talk. I want to first tell you a little bit about the value of open source. What is an open source program office? Why we're creating an OSPO at UC Santa Cruz, and then 2 aspects of what we're trying to achieve is amplifying research impact and simplifying reproducibility. And then I will finish with a quick overview of a case study, which is a project that came out of our open source efforts at UC Santa Cruz. So first of all, industry really values organizations who know about how to engage with open source. There are about 84 major companies and counting. This is actually a quickly increasing number of companies who critically depend on open source ecosystem. These are companies that are, worldwide, international corporations, very well known, as you can see, and they found that open source ecosystems are essential for the success of their business. So all these 84 companies have established an open source program office, and the main goal of these open source program offices is to track and manage the relationship with the open source ecosystem that they depend on. The central role of an OSPO is to execute on the policies and strategy of open source of each of the companies. And obviously, these offices need to be staffed. So you're talking about a major investment of these companies into managing the open source community. What about universities? So how would actually an OSPO look in a university context? And I think it's helpful to look at the mission of research universities. And I give as an example the University of California, and many other universities have very similar missions. There are basically three missions at the University of California, right? Teaching, researching, and providing public service. And it's this last part that I think where open source can really have an impact, where essentially the research results need to be disseminated to the public, right? Translated into something that can be practically used. It's often referred to as technology transfer or translation. And open source actually provides a new path, an alternative path of technology transfer for research universities. And this is something that the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation recognized. And they started funding first with the Johns Hopkins University, and then other universities like RIT, the Rochester Institute of Technology, and then altogether 6 universities, including UC Santa Cruz, to create playbooks for open source program offices within universities, right? These are open source program offices that are adapted to the university context, but essentially have the same idea on how the university as an organization relate to the wider open source community and maintain relationships to open source projects that are important for the university's mission. So UC Santa Cruz is developing one of those OSPOs, and I like to play a quick movie. It's about 1 minute movie about giving an overview of the OSPO.
Today's universe of open source communities has immense potential to amplify the impact of scientific research. But without the right organization and connections, all that potential could drift off into nothing. That's why the UC Santa Cruz Open Source Program Office is here to provide a center of gravity that brings together everything needed to unlock that potential. We promote open source literacy and best practices, helping students learn from open source communities, letting scientists use open source to accelerate research efforts, and connecting students and scientists with industry sponsors whose funding can propel research farther, faster. We also reveal the value of open source to the university, help navigate open source ecosystems, enable engagements that help research programs thrive, and extend the ways open source can help achieve the university's mission. Want to know how you can be involved? Contact us today.
So the 3 gaps that we, the 3 most important gaps that we identified and that sort of guided our design of this open source program office at UC Santa Cruz is, the first gap is there really needs to be more education available for students on how to interact productively in open source communities. The second is there needs to be a way to track the value of open source to the universities. So many projects that came out of universities are actually considered to be sort of side projects that are like kind of hobbies from people, right? Or they're not really associated with the university itself, even though they're based on research in a university. And this is because universities don't have often a way of tracking how open source projects have contributed to the impact that that university has on society. And the way we intend to do this is to basically track funding of open source projects within universities. And the third gap is that there is a huge potential for much more industry engagement over open source projects. Industry has fully embraced open source and has often very sophisticated strategies on how to interact and support open source projects, including funding, but also education, partnerships, engagement with research that is often not fully used. So I want to talk about 2 particular aspects of the OSPO of UC Santa Cruz where we try to address these gaps. And one is what I talked about earlier, this alternative translation path for technologies that are developed in universities. And this is basically summarized as amplifying the research impact via open source. And so the way to think about this is when research happens at the university, the first thing that research becomes public is through publications. But then often there are also research artifacts as part of maybe a reproducibility artifact or some kind of prototype that was created to make a point in the publication. And often these artifacts are valuable enough that they could actually turn into an entire open source project. And so the way to think about this is for an open source project to mature, you need to have a certain ecosystem. And recently, the National Science Foundation created this new program, actually new directorate, which is the Technology, Innovation, partnership directorate, TIP. And part of that directorate, they have a program called Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystems. And the way they define open source ecosystem is you see on the right side, right? So fully fledged open source projects have not only the open source artifacts, so essentially let's say a Git repository, and the scientists and also maybe a user, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff. There's documentation, there's some governance structure, there's a larger developer community that participates in this project. There's security, there's bug management, there's continuous integration and continuous developing and packaging involved. Releases are distributed. There's onboarding of new developers and as well as external users. So this is all hallmarks of a functioning open source ecosystem. And you can think of it as sort of a mature coral reef. On the left side, you see essentially what you find in research, which is the open source product. So it's basically some software that's been published with a license, like an open source license, in a public repository. And there might be one or two external users, right? But it's not much more. And often the scientist is a graduate student. And so in order to mature this project, there's obviously something missing. So the scientist is not interested in spending a lot of time in documentation or testing or release management, all these things. So there's clearly some roles missing to actually move an open source product into an open source ecosystem. And yet a lot of technology, because of that missing link that connects open source products to open source ecosystems, a lot of technology gets basically lost. I will later in this talk about a particular project called Skyhook that evolved as part of our open source efforts at UC Santa Cruz, and that also received NSF funding, especially this post-funding, to create a bridge or to invent these kinds of bridges that we talked about. The other part of the OSPO UC Santa Cruz is to simplify reproducibility and computational research. So as I alluded earlier, a lot of the software that gets created as part of research projects can be used as a reproducibility artifact. So it's not only to create a prototype and then publish measurements, but you actually publish the artifact itself. And this is highly encouraged by more and more conferences that have reproducibility initiatives, like for instance, supercomputing, like is, for quite a while, but also other conferences. So we identified about 18 conferences within the computer science domain that actually have reproducibility awards, best reproducibility artifact award or outstanding artifact awards, right? For published software that support the claims of a published paper. But how do you get actually to the point where it is practical and easy to create these artifacts? And this is something we actually recently received funding in collaboration with the University of Chicago, UC Santa Cruz, and NYU, New York University. It's a project called Repertoire, and we are just getting started. But it's really this idea to create a exchange of these reproducibility artifacts. And how do you, create a tool chain to make creating these and packaging these reproducibility artifacts so that it's easy for authors to create those artifacts. It's easy for reviewers to evaluate these artifacts. And it's also easy for using these artifacts by instructors in the classroom to demonstrate particular claims of a paper, right? Or for students to repeat or reproduce some of these experiments that are published in important papers that are being discussed in a classroom. Or it could be also something that is a baseline for some improvement in other research groups. So this is really important stuff. And to actually create an exchange of both producers of reproducibility artifacts as well as users of these reproducibility artifacts and streamline that process is really the goal of this Repertoire project. So our first steps here of addressing this, we actually work with an emergent interest group for reproducibility and replicability at ACM to organize the first ACM conference on reproducibility and replicability. That conference will be on June 27th and to 29 in 2023 at UC Santa Cruz. Please follow us. We will come out with the call for papers and call for tutorials in a few days. And we're very excited to actually bring a new community that's interested in reproducibility across all computational domains, and are, look really forward to bring this community together for the first time. But then there's also another thing that we do as part of the OSPO, which is this open source research experience. And the way you can think of the open source research experience is really very similar to the Google Summer of Code, which I hope many of you are familiar with. It's essentially a summer program to get students, mostly undergraduate students, involved worldwide in open source projects. We have created for a number of years what we call the open source research experience, where we leverage programs like Google Summer of Code, but also other outreach programs and other sponsors, including from industry, to create a number of summer projects that students can participate in worldwide. And as part of this program, for the first time in this coming year, we have this Summer of Reproducibility. So these are projects that are focusing on reproducibility. And this can be either for creating, for the entire pipeline of reproducibility artifacts, the authoring, the evaluation, and the usage of reproducibility artifacts, and new packaging technologies, various kinds of reproducibility. There's a number of topics that we're also going to discuss on the conference, but there is now a way to combine this with outreach programs like Google Summer of Code to really invigorate a community that is interested in reproducibility. So I highly encourage you to follow those two websites and see what in the next few weeks we will put on there. Last, I want to actually quickly spend some time on our case study. This is Skyhook. It is essentially a way of embedding scientific data management in a composable and efficient way in the storage and network layers. So the way usually data management works is you read a bunch of data from a storage source into a host, right, or compute node or something like that, and then you process the data and you filter, you massage the data, right, down to the stuff that's really interesting, and then you basically store the result or use the result in some ways. Because data sets become so large now, it becomes more and more beneficial to offload some of that to the storage system or to the network layer, so that, for instance, the working set sizes for caches and the host are not as big anymore, because you don't have to load entire huge data set to do these operations, and you don't spend as much time on sending and receiving data that you might not need in the end. Instead, you essentially starting to query data, and just like in databases, but you do this in a more low-level way, where you actually embed the query mechanism within the storage layer or the networking layer. And so we have a first prototype that uses the Apache Arrow in-memory representation of columnar data. That's basically tabular data, but it's laid out in columns, which has huge advantages for advanced analytics like machine learning, where most of the time you look at very big tables, but you're only looking at certain columns at a time. And because columns are all at the same time, they also compress better, and you can actually use vector operations to minimize the cycles you need to to compute data. So Apache Arrow is really well designed. It's a very interesting ecosystem of many tools and across many languages and runtime systems. And we basically found a way to embed it into a storage object so that now the storage object is not only providing data for reads and receiving data for writes, but it also allows to issue queries to that object. And we can do that in a distributed way. So the host has a way of distributing these queries to all the relevant objects. But there's more to it. There's a Ceph extensibility mechanism to add more methods to storage objects. And we were able to actually implement this without any changes to Ceph. So anybody who runs Ceph can actually run this. And we actually contributed this extension to Ceph to the Apache Arrow project. So we documented all this in a paper in CCGrid earlier this year. There's also blog entries that I highly recommend you read if you're interested in this. We are now working with Argonne National Labs on doing something similar with Mochi composable storage system, leveraging a subsystem called Thallium that is extremely efficient RDMA framework that can leverage various hardware acceleration. And we use particle data as a use case. We also are working with Seagate and not only looking at storage system, but also computational storage devices. They're working on a prototype computational storage device based on the Kinetic Open Storage project. There's a lot of ongoing work with the use case of the Human Cell Atlas, which is essentially a genomics project that looks at genomic, the differences in the genome of different cells in the human body based on their location, whether you have a kidney cell or a liver cell or brain cell, so forth. And then finally, we're working with Sandia National Labs on SmartNICs. And here, we're not only looking at one SmartNIC, but we're looking at SmartNICs that collectively act in satisfying a query that is connecting multiple applications in a supercomputer and doing all this data transformations specified by the query in SmartNICs instead of the compute nodes. And again, here we're using as use case particle data. So all this is super exciting. So there's a very strong research component on the Skyhook, but there's also this problem that Skyhook, some of the parts, like for instance, the Ceph plugin that I talked about earlier, is now gaining a maturity where we need to actually invest in the open source ecosystem around that plugin. So having contributed to Apache Arrow means that we are now part of the Apache Arrow project, but there is still, as in all open source communities, there is maintenance involved, right? And so who's maintaining this? It's not going to be the student who's going to be busy to do all these cool research opportunities and needs to write a PhD thesis at some point. It needs to be somebody else who's actually maintaining the code that has reached a certain maturity in order to actually make the project stable and attract more developers and external users to this project. And that's what we want, right? The more external users and developers we attract, the more impact the project will have on society. So, and there is this problem that you see in many open source efforts, but actually this is also more general in business. So there's basically the innovation phase, usually around a very cool idea. You get a lot of research grants, and then the innovation phase kind of ends, and the investment, from the research grants dry up because it's not new anymore, right? But now you have to sort of get through the valley of death until you actually come to a mature phase where the project itself generates some sort of revenue, some sort of support to be sustainable. And it's this gap that we are addressing with the OSPO and with programs and ways to overcome this gap. One of the activities we do for Skyhook is that we got a Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystem grant proposal funded this is a grant that gives us an opportunity to scope essentially what is the Skyhook community, who would be interested in contributing. It's sort of the market research that needs to be done for open source projects to really thrive and to create sort of the key use cases that everybody is interested in. And then also get follow-up funding for getting maintainers hired. And these are often considered to be like research software engineers, right? And there is a large community out there that studies this. And so we need some Skyhook maintainer, but then the cool thing is about research software engineering, these are also the perfect people to help authors to build reproducibility artifacts. We're also looking at collaboration with the Apache Error community. And we found that industry is very, very eager to help with that. And we have found a really nice way of doing that, which is what we call the open source gift letters. When you give a gift to a university, there is a gift letter involved. It establishes that some amount of money was given to a nonprofit organization like the Public University of California. But it also, you can actually write more things into this gift letter. Even though a gift is usually something you can't attach any strings to it, no IP agreements or anything like that. But you can write in the intention that everything that comes out of this gift in terms of software is going to be open source licensed. And so that's turns out a very attractive thing for the industry. And so we're definitely going to pursue that. So I want to stop here and open up for questions. Thank you very much.
All right, let's thank our speaker. All right, do we have any questions? Carlos is online. Okay, Carlos, I'll start with one. If this program had existed previously before Ceph was developed, how do you think that would have impacted that project?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, there's definitely it would have taken a different path. Sage Weil, the student who created Ceph, would have not spent as much time trying to get Ceph off the ground with like 2 or 3 other programmers, right? And would have created more or gotten more help to create a larger group of programmers. And it would have accelerated probably the project by a number of years, I think. As he spent almost as much time from writing the thesis, he spent almost as much time to actually get to a point where the project was actually sustainable, and we want to shorten that.
Any questions in the room? Nope, we have no more questions. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
Let's thank our speaker again. And with that ends our session. We have another intermission, and then we have the closing.